Welcome, everyone. My name's Charles Iceland. I direct global and national water initiatives at the World Resources Institute. I'm pleased to host this online launch of Aqueduct Floods version 2.0. Our agenda will feature a number of speakers. First, we'll have introductory remarks from André Haspels, Ambassador of the Kingdom of the Netherlands to the United States. We'll then have my colleague Samantha Kuzma, an associate at the World Resources Institute in our water program. She's going to introduce aqueduct floods and methods for global flood analysis. A presentation by my colleague and good friend Philip Ward, who's a professor of global water risk dynamics and head of global water and climate risk at the Vrije University of Amsterdam's Institute for Environmental Studies. We'll then have another colleague and good friend of mine, Willem Ligtvoet, a program manager for water, climate, and adaptation at the PBL Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency. He's going to provide a talk on the geography of future water challenges. We'll then have a question and answer session moderated by Marlena Chertok, Communications Specialist for WRI's water team. And we'll conclude with some concluding remarks given by Yohannes Kesete, Disaster Risk Management Specialist with the World Bank, speaking in his personal capacity. So I want to begin by thanking the Netherlands Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management for its very generous 4-year grant to conduct the research and develop the online tool we're launching today. I want to also thank the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands here in Washington for its ongoing support of the project since its inception. Not only has the Embassy supported the intellectual and technical development of this tool, it's also helped conduct outreach for the current version of the tool. In fact, my good friend Jan Pela here at the Embassy arranged for us to present the tool to none other than King Willem Alexander of the Netherlands when he visited Washington in 2015. I also want to express my deep appreciation to all our partners on this project who have created a masterful product and done so with grace and even enjoyment in the process. These partners include Deltares, the University of Amsterdam Institute for Environmental Studies, PBL Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency, and Utrecht University. This was a team effort in every sense of the word. And now I want to turn to some Aqueduct Floods user stories. So WRI and its partners launched the initial version of Aqueduct Floods, version 1.0, in 2014. Since then, it's been widely used, including in some high-profile ways. Every year, flooding affects millions of people in Southeast Asia, more than any other hazard. And the Pacific Disaster Center has used aqueduct floods data to develop risk and vulnerability assessment guidelines for Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN member states. These member states are using these guidelines to inform risk-reducing policy and investment decisions across Southeast Asia. A second example comes from the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. The Climate Center uses aqueduct floods in its worldwide training program to help decision makers communicate current and future flood risks in terms of the number of lives affected and dollars lost in the countries, states, and watersheds they are responsible for. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ambassador André Haspels, who will deliver some introductory remarks. But first, André Haspels is Ambassador of the Kingdom of the Netherlands to the United States, based in Washington, D.C. Ambassador Haspels studied politics at the Vrije University of Amsterdam. In 1987, he joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands, where he served in many capacities. In 1997, he became head of political department at the embassy in South Africa, in Pretoria, where he was involved in cooperation between the Netherlands and South Africa, among others in the setup of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He later served as ambassador in Vietnam, and when he returned to South Africa as well, and most recently as Director General of Political Affairs in The Hague. Ambassador Haspels, welcome and thank you again for your nation's support for the tool we're launching today.
Thank you very much, Charlie, and thanks for your kind introduction. Good morning, everybody. If I look at the number of participants, we are over 240, which is, I think, great. It's a little bit getting used to this new form of engaging and reaching out. Not only we've made a special background, which I hope you can see all, but also it feels still a bit uncomfortable to be in your bedroom, which is now an office where you sit with your tie and your suit, where normally I would be in much more comfortable clothes when I'm at home. But this is how it is. My pressman said, listen, this is a public meeting. Everybody can join in. So you should act as an ambassador and look like an ambassador. So that's why I feel a bit awkward being at home with my tie and all that, but still it's great to be here, and we have to adapt. And let's be honest, if there is a community that has to adapt, and that should be resilient enough to be in a situation where we have a shelter in place, that a community that has to adapt by organizing ourselves in a webinar, it would be this community, the community that is interested in climate adaptation. So as you probably know, we need more of that ability to adapt in the future, not only to deal with the consequences of the virus, but also because of climate change and the flood risks that it brings us and the need to adapt. I mean, flooding is already the most costly natural disaster, if I don't take into account the virus, causing almost 46 billion in economic losses worldwide in 2019 alone, and more than 1 trillion in losses globally since 1980. And the impact will only increase over time because our population will grow, the climate change will lead to higher sea levels, to more volatile rivers, to more extreme storms. So I think it is our duty to reduce that risk. And I'm sure that the Netherlands, as you know, is a low-lying country at the end of a delta where many rivers come together and flow into the sea. And we only exist because we have learned over the many centuries to manage water effectively. We've learned to keep our feet dry, but we've also learned to live with the water when needed. And I think that is crucial for us in our country, to deal with the water, not only in terms of risks, but also in terms of the challenges that it poses. So I think we'd like to share the knowledge that we've learned. We feel that we have a role to play in promoting good water management on a global scale, also, of course, as part of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Now, the availability of water and protection against flooding are obvious targets, but good water management is also a key component of other sustainable development goals, like, for instance, food security, like the healthy ecosystems. So from that perspective, I'm happy to be here for the launch of two tools that have been developed by a consortium of Dutch research institutes in collaboration with the World Resources Institute. The first tool is the Aqueduct floods tool, and the other one is the Geography of Future Water Challenges. And the Aqueduct floods is a tool that measures coastal and riverine floods risks around the world under current baseline conditions and future projections. So actually it examines the extent to which populations, GDP, urban property will be impacted by flooding. And you can also use the tool to calculate the return on investment for flood protection in any river basin worldwide. The other tool, the Geography of Future Water Challenges, is a tool that analyzes the costs and the investment for various pathways to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals related to water. So I'm very proud to say that these two tools have been developed by the WRA of course, in close cooperation with a number of organizations that I would also like to mention here, Dutch research institutes like Deltares, like the Vrije University in Amsterdam, the Institute for Environmental Studies, like the Utrecht University, and like the PBL, the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency. As you mentioned, Charlie, the development of the tools was funded by the Dutch Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management and the World Bank. We're very grateful for that. And both tools, as I mentioned, provide the insight to develop the right policies and investment strategies to keep people and our economies safe from flooding. So I'm proud of our Dutch contribution to these projects, and I hope they will find their way to as many actors as possible. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, and now we'll have Samantha Kuzma, one of the brains behind this fabulous new tool. She'll introduce Aqueduct Flood. So take it away, Sam.
Great. Thank you so much, Charlie, and thank you, Ambassador. And to everyone who is joining us today, thank you for being here to be a part of this launch event. My name is Samantha Kuzma, and I'm an associate with the World Resources Institute. I've been a part of this Aqueduct Floods team for a few years now, and I think I speak for the whole team when I say we're so excited to finally be sharing this tool with you today. Now, flooding can be a deeply personal experience. For example, I grew up in the floodplain of a small tributary, and while my family was really lucky in terms of flooding, I still remember during Hurricane Floyd just watching my dad's face as water came and swallowed our backyard and reached our back door. And I think, you know, I'm not alone in that experience. I think a lot of us on this call could share a similar event of a flood that has just stuck with them through time. But it's as we zoom out from these personal anecdotes and start looking at flood data or flooding more collectively, we really begin to understand the enormity of its impact. We've already heard flooding has caused more than $1 trillion in losses globally since the 80s. Last year in the United States alone, flooding in just 3 river basins caused $20 billion in damages. On this map, those are represented by the green circles. So that was half of all weather and climate related damages in the US that year, including some major wildfires out west. And as we look forward, we only expect flooding to get worse. This is going to be driven by heavier rains and storms fueled by climate change, socioeconomic factors such as population growth and increased development near coasts and rivers, and land subsidence, you know, the sinking of cities from things like overdrawing groundwater. We understand that flooding is a problem, but what's less understood are the specifics. You know, where is flood risk the highest? How is that going to change over time? And most importantly, what can we do about it? It's hard to get access to flood maps that cover your area of interest, and it's even harder to find ones that project flood risk into the future. As a result, flood risks are often underestimated and poorly managed, particularly in less developed regions. That's where Aqueduct Floods comes in. Aqueduct Floods is an open source online platform that measures and maps global flood risk. This tool estimates riverine and coastal flood risk, both now and in the future. Specifically, we look at risk to urban assets, GDP, and population for every state, country, and major river basin around the world, as well as in 120 select cities. There are many exciting features that will be on our new tool, including existing flood protection levels per state, all around the world. This is going to be incredibly useful for understanding current hazard mitigation responses currently ongoing around the world. We also offer the ability to assess the cost and benefits of adapting to riverine flood risk with our new cost and benefit analyzer. Again, these are designed to help us strategize about solutions to the flooding problem. In short, Aqueduct Floods puts actionable flood data at your fingertips. It's never been easier for us to understand and to communicate the flood risks and opportunities. But this is a lot to conceptualize, so let me actually show you what I'm talking about. So, for example, let's say you're an analyst at a development bank. You're going to work in a new country, Tanzania, and you've read on the news about flood disasters in this location. you think that an investment in flood infrastructure might be really valuable. But how can you determine if that's true? And even more, how can you communicate that with someone like the local government? Well, Aqueduct floods can help. I'm gonna walk us through a tool demonstration showing how you can use Aqueduct floods to help answer these questions. So let's see it in action. The first thing you'll see on Aqueduct floods is our hazards page. Here you can explore inundation maps for both riverine and coastal flood hazards. We show gridded flood depth volumes at around a 1 by 1 kilometer resolution. And these maps are interactive, so you can zoom into your area of interest. So for example, let's zoom into Tanzania and look at the hazard map. And if you look at the bottom right of the page, you'll see a legend that allows you to look at different flood events, flood event magnitudes based on return periods. So the higher the number, the more severe the hazard. So let's switch to the 50-year flood. This has about a 2% probability of occurring in a given year. And let's see what this flood will look like in 2030. So this blue box up here helps you navigate between years. And for future years, you can also select which climate scenario you want to project, as well as which global model. So we ran the riverine analysis using 5 different global circulation models. And we ran the coastal analysis using 3 different sea level rise scenarios. So with this tab, you can visually see the hazard through time. But the hazard is just one part of the risk equation. We must look at hazard in conjunction with exposure and vulnerability to truly understand risk. And our risk tab does that work for you. So on our risk tab, we can see how risk changes over time, understand why it's changing, and benchmark it against other locations. So let's start by looking at a flood-prone region in Tanzania, Shinyanga. Okay, and this blue panel, again, is where you can create the analysis. You can choose the location, select which hazard to examine, and choose the exposure indicator of interest. So let's switch to the affected population, and we'll also turn on our advanced view. This gives you some more customization options as well as some more widgets. Okay, and now just to orient you, below the blue panel, you'll see a slider. So here we provide that estimated flood protection level, but we also realize you may have better local knowledge. That's why you can manually enter in the flood protection value and rerun the analysis on the fly. So looking to the right at the top, you'll see a summary table. This just pulls out some key insights from the analysis, but I'll draw your attention to the graph below it, the blue bar graph. So this is visualizing absolute and relative risk through time, with time on the x-axis. We can clearly see that risk is increasing, but to make these results even more meaningful, we've added the option of uncertainty bars. So like I said earlier, the riverine analysis runs through 5 different types of models. The blue bar graph is representing the average of the models, but we also wanted to give you the ability to look at the full range. So in this example, it might be a little hard to see, but the black bar represents that range. And here we can see that range is actually pretty small. So the models seem to be agreeing on what flooding in the future will look like. Okay, and finally, I will show you our drivers of projected change. So let's scroll down. And here we can see what's driving increased flood risk. We see an orange bar and a red bar. Those represent climate change and socioeconomic growth as drivers. And they both seem to be contributing to increased flooding in this area. And this has major implications for what kind of recommendations we should think about in terms of mitigation strategies. For example, this region might want to explore policies that limit development in high-risk floodplains, as well as some infrastructure solutions. And to make things easier, if you look to the right of each widget, you'll see a drop-down. Here you can download or embed any of the widgets into your own communication or analysis. All right, so now you can see where the risk is severe and you can communicate how and why it's changing. But let's add in the final piece, the opportunity. So I'm just gonna quickly explain our cost-benefit analysis, and Philip is going to go into much more detail about all of this data. This is limited to just riverine flooding and does not include any cities. So basically, we calculate urban damage without any investment in flood infrastructure through time, using the existing flood protection level. Then we recalculate it, but this time using a designed flood protection level. This is representing future flood damage with investment in flood infrastructure. The difference between these two scenarios becomes our benefit, avoided damage through intervention. We then calculate the cost associated with that investment, from construction costs to maintenance. And you can customize the parameters. Over here on the left, you'll see we give a lot of different options, from infrastructure to the cost elements. And you can always click on that question mark to understand what we're actually prompting you for, or to get more information about anything on this tool. All right, so finally, let's assess the investment opportunity. So if we look at our first graph, cumulative cost and benefits, we see by 2054, the benefits start to outpace the cost. And we can understand this better by looking at the next graph, which breaks down cost and benefits per year. Again, you can download this information straight into Excel even if you wanted to add this to your analysis. And finally, we'll look at the cost-benefit ratio. So any number that's less than 1 means it's a feasible investment. In other words, if you were to flip this equation, you'd see that for every dollar spent on infrastructure investment, there's a return of $3 in avoided damage. So it looks like this is an economic investment. Okay, so you as an analyst can now confidently recommend investment in flood protection infrastructure, and you have an arsenal of visualizations pre-made to help support your argument. Now with that, I'm gonna pass it off to Dr. Philip Ward so you could actually learn about what's powering this information.
Okay, thank you very much, Sam. I'll just share my screen. Do you see the screen okay? Yeah. Okay, so thanks for that explanation of the tool. I have been given the honor of explaining about 5 years of scientific development analysis in the next 10 minutes. So I look forward to doing that. Obviously, this will be quite a high-level description of some of the methods that we've been developing. But all of the researchers, scientists, and developers involved will be very happy to answer any questions also after the webinar, which we don't manage to answer right now. So what I'm going to be talking about in the next 10 minutes is 3 things, basically: the flood risk assessment, the flood risk framework that we use within this tool. And then briefly something about the methods that we use to assess those flood risks, and then those methods that we use to assess the costs and the benefits of the levies. So the framework, we use a internationally accepted standard framework to define flood risk. So this is what we're talking about when we talk about the flood risk analysis. We understand risk to be a function of 3 aspects, basically: the hazard, the exposure, and the vulnerability. So the hazard really is the physical threatening event itself, so the physical flood, of its probability, like Sam talked about, and its physical characteristics. So for example, the depth of the flooding, how rapidly does the water rise, these kinds of things. Then we have the exposure, which is all about the elements, so the people, the buildings, the economic values, things like that, which are potentially in harm's way if a flood were to occur. So here, for example, we see downtown Manhattan. Obviously, a lot of people live in there, a lot of economic activity, and so the exposure is high. And then we have the vulnerability, defined as the resistance or the lack of resistance of those exposed elements to the hazard. And, well, it's a little bit of a mouthful, this explanation. But basically, I think this photo shows it quite well. So here we see a house, which is actually on a floodplain. There's a flood hazard going on at this time. Obviously, there's exposure because it's a house, it has an economic value. It also has a social value to the people living there. But because it's raised on these poles that you see, it's less vulnerable. So if we want to assess risk, we have to look at all of these hazard aspects. And these really are different all around the world, but also within an individual city. So here, for example, we see a hazard. We see a coastal flood, a river flood, so the kind of floods that we have in this tool. We see different areas on this figure that show different exposure. On the left is very modern architecture compared to the right, for example. And we also see the different vulnerability. So those houses on the right, on the water, whilst those houses in the middle, raised on stilts, are not on the water, therefore less vulnerable. And so if we want to assess risk, we have to assess these three things. So how do we do this within the Aqueduct tool? Basically, we use a chain of models developed by all of the partners involved in this project called GLOFRIS. And what GLOFRIS does basically is combine those three aspects. So we start by taking various hazard maps. For example, here we see a hazard map for a 1 in 100 year flood, but we have all kinds of different flood maps. And then we combine those with some data, some maps on exposure. For example, here we see a map of population density, but that could also be GDP, land use, and so forth. Then we combine that with some information on vulnerability, so-called depth damage functions, and I'll come back to that later in the talk. And by doing this, we can actually estimate the impacts for different flood return periods. So for the 10-year flood, the 100-year flood, the 1,000-year flood, and so forth. And we can do that in different ways. For example, economic damage in dollars, number of affected people, mortalities, affected GDP, and so forth. When we talk about the risk, we also want to know something about the average damages, the average impacts per year. So then we also calculate the expected annual impacts across all of those different kinds of flood magnitudes. Just to zoom in one slide on the river hazard, we develop these kinds of hazard maps like we see here with a 1 kilometer resolution. Here's an example of a 100-year flood depth map. And basically that's developed using a state-of-the-art global hydrological model, PCR GLOB WB, developed at Utrecht University. So this model is forced with climate data, precipitation, temperature, and a few other variables. And out of that, we get river flow and overbank flow, so how much water is flowing outside of the river for every day. And that's forced with climate data for the current period based on reanalysis data, so based on observations and models. And for the future, using 5 global climate models and various projections. From this then, we then use an inundation model, which gives us those kinds of hazard maps that you can see on the right. We produce similar maps for coastal hazard, and this is a new part of the new tool. Here we see an example of such a map on the right, and to do that, we use the global tide and surge model developed by Deltares in the Netherlands, together with the Vrije University in Amsterdam. And this is a model, a hydrodynamic model, where we can, for each time step, simulate the sea level as a result of tide and storm surge. And we also include in that tropical cyclones, by actually simulating the tracks of cyclones like Hurricane Katrina, which we can see here, an example of what such a simulation looks like. Once we have these sea levels, we can then estimate which areas would be flooded. Now, a really important aspect when we look at flood hazard globally is subsidence. In some coastal deltas, delta cities, where there's a lot of groundwater extraction, subsidence can be taking place very rapidly. It's a huge problem, up to some areas up to 100 millimeters per year, for example. And at Utrecht University, projections of global subsidence have been made, which are included within this tool. Then we have the exposure. So I already said we can use maps of land use, of GDP, of population, again at 1 kilometer resolution, and we have those for the current period. Our colleagues at PBL in the Netherlands developed a model, 2UP, which also allows us to project increases in population, GDP, and changes in land use in the future. So that's, for example, what we see here. We see the growth in urban population between 1960 and 2050. And we use these kinds of scenarios within the tool. And then the final element was the vulnerability. So here I show these so-called depth damage functions. So we have different land use classes, for example, residential area, commercial area, industrial area. And these functions basically show how much damage would occur for a different water depth. Obviously, if I have a flood of 5 meters, for example, it causes more damage than a flood of 2 centimeters. And that's basically what's represented in these functions. Now, Sam already mentioned that if we really want to make an accurate estimate of risk, we need to know what protection, so what level of levies, etc., are already in place. And this kind of information before this project simply was not available at the global scale. So as part of this project at the Vrije University in Amsterdam, we developed this FlowPros global database of protection standards, which is free for everybody to use and is really a backbone of this tool. It maps for every state or province of the world an estimate of the current protection standard. And then we move finally to those costs and the benefits of the levies. And that's shown conceptually how we do that here. So here we see a city with a river running along it, and it's been embanked by levees. We estimate the cost of the construction of these dikes, which is, in essence, we have to estimate the height of a dike, so the height, the extra height that we want on a dike to adapt, for example, to climate change. We then have to estimate the length of that dike running through the areas that we want to protect. And when we know that, we multiply that by some unit costs. So what does it actually cost to build a kilometer of dike? On top of that, we add maintenance costs. And within the tool, the user can actually estimate those maintenance costs as a percentage of the construction costs. We generally take 1% per year. The final step then is the benefits of those levies, and that's a reasonably simple assumption in essence. And basically we say that the benefits to society are the economic risk or the damage, the economic damage if we don't adapt in the future, so if we don't increase the height of our dikes, minus the economic risk or damage if we do adapt. So they are what we call the benefits. And I just want to show one example of what those benefit cost ratios can look like in the future. So this is one example, just one scenario for coastal flood protection by the end of the 21st century of what the benefit cost ratio is of adapting to climate change and socio-economic development. So basically those green colors showing benefits exceeding the costs. Of course, there's limitations. A few to mention are that within this tool, we don't look at compound river and coastal flooding. So we look at separately at coastal floods and river floods, but not the combination of the two, which can really interact to cause even bigger floods in some deltas. One should not use this tool for a very point location analysis, but it can be used to sketch hotspots and scenarios of change at a more aggregated level. And as I said, we've discussed, we only look at adaptation through levies in this tool, whilst there's many other measures that can be taken to reduce risk. And the next presentation, we'll also hear that there are still developments going on to also develop methods to look at those kinds of measures. And finally, a nice list of reading you can look through during lockdown. So that was it for my presentation. I'll hand back to Sam.
Okay, I've unmuted myself. Great. Thank you so much, Philip. That was excellent. And now we'll turn it over to Willem to discuss the geography of future water challenges.
Willem, you're still on mute.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Let me first say that we are very pleased that we can contribute to this webinar and to the launch of Aqueduct Floods. And we would really like to congratulate WRI of this achievement of getting this very complex tool done in the end. For us, it started already 10 years ago when we found in the PBL model instruments that we were still lacking a global flood risk model. So on a very modest scale, we invited Deltares and the Vrije University and the University of Utrecht to start building a global flood risk model. But that really got a boost when WRI came in and we got a substantial financial support of the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management. So today we are very pleased that this eventually comes in a very nice instrument as Aqueduct Floods. So in the next few slides, I would like to give you a flavor of how we use the global flood risk model in our global assessments. And I think Aqueduct floods, one of the great advantages is that they bridge the scale across scales, the analysis, and contribute to the consistency of analysis on country scale, regional scale, and also global scale. So I would like to share with you the example of the Geography of Future Water Challenges we published in 2018. And within that, we had 6 main themes: water and food production, water pollution, human health, flooding, water-related energy production, also ecological quality of aquatic ecosystems, and the relation between water migration and conflict. Hey, why does it? Yeah. So today it's about flooding, of course, and how we use Aqueduct tools. And here you see a summarizing page in the report with, on the left side, showing on a global scale the number of people living in flood-prone areas in rivers, coastal zones, and deltas. And you see that from 2010 to 2050, there's a huge increase of almost 50% of people living in flood-prone areas. Then based on the global flood risk model, we were able to assess that in flood risks, and that's the right side. You see on top the annual economic damage in billions US dollars, and you see on the lower side, you see the annual exposed population in millions. And the browns are the 2050 projections, and the 2010 are the blue ones. And as already mentioned before, you see an enormous domination of the flood risks in South Asia and East Asia Pacific, but also Sub-Saharan Africa is increasing. We also built a website, and that is going to be a tool for a not very specialized people to see how things change in the world. Here you see the same graph, but now on a map, and also showing the changes in population exposed in 2010. The light blue halves, and 2050 are the dark blue ones. And also here you see the domination of Southeast Asia and also Sub-Saharan Africa. So this is exposed population from river floods. And here you have on the same scale the population exposed to coastal floods, which in number of people is far less, as you see. And within this website we have built, we've also provided, based on the Aqueduct floods data, that you can click on each country and then you see the buildup of the flood risks. Here's the example of coastal flood risks in Bangladesh. And you see the actual population at risk in the light blue on the left. And you see the projected exposed population by 2050 on the right-hand side in the black bar. And in between, the green bars, they show what is the contribution of different drivers. So you have population growth, which is the leftish one. Then you have the contribution of sea level rise in the middle. And then, as mentioned before, the impact of the effect of soil subsidence, the right greenish aspect. So this gives a general reader and user idea of what is the relative contribution of different drivers to the future changes. So we actually have this only for the business as usual. And in the project as we are doing now, we want to build solutions. So future pathways with solutions aiming at a low ambition, a moderate ambition, or high ambition future. And this low ambition could be, say, just a small improvement in the reduction of flood risks. Moderate ambition, of course, higher, but high ambition, not only a high reduction level of flood risks, but also a high ambition when it comes to maximizing the co-benefits with respect to SDGs. So in the high ambition pathway, we envision there will be an important effort in using nature-based solutions. So at the moment, with the partners involved, we are building the storylines for these low, moderate, and high ambition levels. They will be translated into the what, the measures. Then we will, with the same model instrument, calculate the costs of these measures, the effect in terms of reduced flood risks, and finally also evaluate the contributions to the SDGs. So here we have a kind of format how we can show how certain pathways will contribute more or less to the SDGs. So just to give an example of the pathways and how you can have a look at what the outcome of the pathways will be. This is based on still a first orientation on solutions in the Future Water Challenges 1. And you see, for instance, that if the blue bar above is the millions of people annual exposed without any protection. Philip showed you the FlowPros map, which gives the flood protection we have now. And based on that, we have a substantial reduction of people annually exposed, up to 65 million people. Then towards 2015, the green bar, if you maintain the current protection standards and do not adjust them to population growth or economic growth, it will increase to 133 million people. So it will almost double. And if you adapt to climate change, so only adjusting to climate change, then there's a reduction to 108 million people. Then finally, as mentioned, cities are hotspots of population, economic assets, and investments. So if you have an extra effort on protecting cities, then you see that even with not so high protection levels, you can reduce the number of people annually affected substantially. So this is only an example, and we hope that in the future, and that will be by 2023, we will have, for the flood risks and coastal areas and deltas, pathways showing how the flood risks in the world could develop under different choices of scenarios. So we are building these pathways, but we are also doing some new modeling work. As mentioned, in aqueduct flood risks, for protection against flooding, only technical measures are including the levees. But as I showed in our high ambition level, and also in view of a sustainable development, we want to pay attention to the use of nature-based solutions. So the Free University of Amsterdam, PBL, and Deltares together, we support now a PhD research on building nature-based solution in Gloveris. And that will allow us in the future to compare technical solutions versus nature-based solutions, and also explore not only the economic benefits or the reduced people affected, but also the ecological aspects. And hopefully this PhD will be ready by 2023-24. So this was just a short view on what we are doing at the moment. And we hope to come back to you in phases with our results. And also this afternoon, our website will be updated by 11 o'clock Eastern Time, and then the figures I showed you also for the coastal floods will be included. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much, Willem. We're now going to go on to do a question and answer session moderated by Marlena Chertok, communication specialist at WRI. Marlena, take it away.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this morning. I'm just going to read out some questions and pass it along to the panelists, and whoever is able to respond, please do so. We have a question from Vance Marola. Thanks for the example of investment decision using the tool. Can you speak to how a company might use the tool to assess and monetize flood risks associated with a large number of suppliers?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for the question. And I assume by a large number of suppliers, you mean assets in many different locations. So I would say our tool is more focused on digging deep into a particular location. You do have the ability of comparing two different locations at the same time. And of course, you could use the hazard maps to look at large areas at the same time. But to look at many different places, right now the tool is set up that you would look individually and really understand the risks within each location. But we're happy to work with people if they have needs with this data. And Philip, do you have something?
Yeah, thanks. So I think that's a good answer. One thing that one can do, I think, is that the tool gives an idea if one supply chain, for example, is located in very flood hazard prone areas in different regions of the world. So by examining those localities where one knows that their own supply chain is located, it's possible to get a first impression of whether there are interdependencies there as well.
And I guess just to build on the answer, one of the benefits of all the Aqueduct tools is they serve as a risk prioritization tool. So you as a company may source supplies, agricultural supplies, or other types of supplies in 100 different locations, let's say. But you don't have enough money and personnel to be mitigating risk in the same way in all 100 places. You might only have time and money to focus on the top 10 risk areas. So you can use Aqueduct floods to look at where your highest risks are and begin to come up with plans in those highest risk areas.
Great, and moving on to, from Venkat Koloru, great tool. Do you include confidence levels based on types of global CC models so that supply chain, flood risk, or asset level risk can be properly evaluated for investment firms?
So we include a few different features that I think could help with this. Like I mentioned, for each model run, the model or the analysis is run through multiple models. And so we allow you to see the range of those models. And then we also include options for different climate scenarios looking into the future. So we're using, we have a more pessimistic view that's looking at steadily increasing carbon emissions, as well as an optimistic climate view. And so that can help you also understand how future climate projections may vary.
Great. Somebody is curious about, Pete Klope is curious, is this mostly relevant for public investment or private investment too?
It works for both. Like Charlie said, this tool is more about prioritization. It's a first screening to understand what are the potentials so that you know how to use your resources to dig deeper into a certain location. So I say that any type of organization could use that to gain that knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, just to build on that a little more, Aqueduct Floods is a strategic tool. It helps people either on the outside in international organizations or on the inside, could be national level leaders or state or provincial leaders, to basically understand the risks at a high level and to start to think generally if they pursued a strategy of increasing protection throughout their state or country, what would be the costs and benefits to that. As the speaker said, it's not meant to be a project level tool. The project level tool obviously has the advantages of informing an actual project. The limitation of the project level tool is it doesn't enable you to kind of look at the bigger picture and devise a strategy. So those are the uses and limitations of aqueduct floods, and they can be used for either private or public sector users.
May I add to that? I think a tool like this is a very formalized way of providing the best available knowledge on a certain detail, and provide, say, the opportunity to have different stakeholders together looking at what are the problems and what are the options. And also with future flood risk reduction, maybe there are also joint efforts needed from private companies and public authorities. So building a shared idea of what's the problem and what are the options is, I think, one of the great values of Aqueduct.
So we have quite a few questions coming in and only a few minutes left. So what I think we'll do is collect all of these questions and be able to respond at a later time as well. But here's just a few more. Somebody is curious about the spatial granularity of the tool. Would the tool be able to map sub-city flood risk, like certain neighborhoods that are most at risk? And if not, is there future potential to include this?
Yeah, maybe I can take this. Hazel Winsemius from the Netherlands speaking from Deltares. I'll just switch on my video. So I didn't join the speakers, but I'm in the panel. So for city level risks, the granularity we cover is about 1 square kilometer. And at city level, other things than features that we've included so far become really important. So for instance, if you're in a city, for instance, the fact that a bridge has a limited conveyance capacity for water could actually be the cause of a flood rather than the conveyance capacity of the river itself. So in this global scale tool, we include the conveyance capacity of the rivers, but not so much the conveyance capacity of, for instance, those very local things like bridges. So you run into the risk that you have a wrong perspective on, very precise. Hey, you get the feeling you have a pretty precise picture, but it actually may not. If you really focus on a detail, it may actually not give you the detail that you need. So for a city, it may give you a first estimate on the city overall, but for the city itself, within the city, I would definitely start focusing on more detailed methods where you include such features, such as local infrastructure, local bridges, impediments to flows, weirs, and so on and so forth.
And Haspels, Deltares has that great tool that can simulate floods in cities. I'm forgetting the name. What is that?
So Deltares, we develop hydrodynamic models that you can definitely use in cities. But then again, you need to introduce details that really give you a perspective on where flow can be blocked or conveyed. What we focus on is especially terrain data is very critical. So what does the terrain actually look like, the elevation levels with respect to the rivers. So this is also where we introduce combinations of very local data like OpenStreetMap data and rich terrain, so that we have a better idea of how water actually is conveyed or blocked within a city. And this tool that you're mentioning, Charlie, is called Parterra. I think that's what you're referring to. And so it's a set of tools to enrich existing terrain data with local features.
And that would be a tool that would complement a first pass, a first look at floods in a region with aqueduct floods, and then a much more in-depth analysis using a separate tool like that.
Yeah, so you could, for instance, think of preparing a aqueduct floods for a particular region or city even, which has similar kind of features, but at a much higher granularity, fed with much more granular data. I think that's what Charlie is hinting towards. It's definitely possible, yeah.
All right, and we're collecting all of your questions, but we're going to move into concluding remarks. Thank you so much.
Okay, so, and with these concluding remarks, we have Yohannes Kesete speaking from Dar es Salaam. Take it away, Yohannes.
Oh, oops. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right. Thank you very much, Charlie. Really appreciate it. My name is Yohannes Kesete. I'm a senior disaster risk management specialist for the World Bank. I want to congratulate the team. It's been really great to work with everybody in the past 3-4 years. I'm very happy that we've reached this stage. I'll keep my remarks very brief. I think this tool is really useful because the main challenge has been that there is generally lack of data in many developing countries to be able to do any kind of reliable assessment. And when an analysis is required, we would still revert back to these global models. But then the timing doesn't really align with the project preparation or with the discussions going on. So I think this tool really answers that question, to be able to collate all the knowledge, the global information that is available and put it in one platform and provide a consistent way of providing information on hazard, risk, and even going one step further and providing cost benefits analysis for interventions. So that's a huge advantage, and it would also allow to compare various regions and various river basins in terms of what the risk level is. So this is something that you cannot really get from a localized information. I think the second, important contribution is the incorporation of climate change. There's a lot of talk about what the impact of climate change would be to communities, economy, infrastructure. But again, it's computationally expensive, it requires expertise, the data is always not available. But this tool actually provides the user an opportunity to use different climate change models and to look at various scenarios, worst case, good case scenarios, and various time range, ranging from 2030 to 2080. So this is a huge advantage. Obviously, because it's a global tool, everybody understands the limitation on granularity, maybe the accuracy of the absolute values, but I feel like the relative values and understanding, what the relative difference of risk in various regions and different river basins is. So this is a huge contribution. And lastly, the ability to change that hazard and risk information into a dollar value and to be able to speak in terms of how much the damage would be if there's no intervention, and what the benefit would be if a certain dollar amount of intervention is put into place. I've never, so we actually started with doing a very comprehensive review of tools, open source tools that can do cost benefit analysis, but all of them have their strengths and weaknesses, and they're not very comprehensive, or if they are, they're computationally very expensive, so it's very hard to run them and analyze the data. So this tool kind of answers all of these questions. It brings all the knowledge, information, puts it in one platform, allows the user to understand the current and the future, and allows to have that strategic view of the region in terms of what flood risk is and what the impact is on the economy and communities. So very happy to be part of this project, and we look forward in collaborating and also building on this and showing some use cases of how this tool could be useful at a regional level to set regional strategies or to initiate conversations for big interventions. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much, Charlie.
Thanks, Yohannes. So I think that concludes our webinar. And Marlena, unless I'm missing something, I really want to thank everybody for joining. And I urge you to look at the tool and get back to us. We always enjoy feedback, what's working well, what's not working as well. So thank you, and have a good rest of your day.